The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome back to another episode of Francis Watch, sponsored by Novus Ordo Watch. I'm your host, Stephen Heiner, and with us, as always, is His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary in Brooksville, Florida, and Father Anthony Cekada, Associate Pastor of St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio. Your Excellency, Father, thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here again.
Yes, once again, thank you.
Your Excellency, we were talking before the show that there's not as much news for this episode. It could be that even Francis takes vacations.
Well, he certainly takes vacations from thinking.
I just haven't seen too much lately that is anything different from what he has said before. That's, he hasn't come out with any real, let's say, Novus Ordo bombs in the past, 6 months that I can tell. There's it's his usual stuff. So, it may not be as interesting as usual. Let's put it that way.
But of course, he runs on like a loop. In addition to being loopy, his brain runs on a loop with some of these ideas. And they keep on showing up, as Bishop Sanborn pointed out. And, maybe it's a question of just sort of conditioning the people by saying the same thing over and over again.
And I think that's something beneficial to reflect on, Father. One of the things I've been doing this season for Francis Watches, I've been going back and I've been listening to old Francis Watches. A lot of our listeners may not realize we've got almost 36 Francis Watches. And listening to you and His Excellency talk about these issues over and over, there's the point of repetition of Catholic doctrine. Well, that never gets old. But what's interesting is he continues to repackage his errors in all of these different ways. But as you say, it's on a loop of sorts. And one of the generators of these loops is, I guess the Novus Ordo sect would call him Saint Paul VI. And I wanted to read the formula for his so-called canonization. For the honor of the Blessed Trinity, the exaltation of the Catholic faith, and the increase of the Christian life, by the authority of our Lord Jesus Christ and of the holy apostles Peter and Paul and our own, after due deliberation and frequent prayer for divine assistance, and having sought the counsel of many of our brother bishops, we declare and define Blessed Paul VI and a number of other names to be saints, and we enroll them among the saints, decreeing that they are to be venerated as such by the whole Church, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Now, Excellency, we've talked about this on multiple episodes, not just for Francis Watch, but for Restoration. The Recognize and Resist school will tell us that canonizations are not infallible, but what does language like this denote for Catholics?
It denotes a definition that declare and define it's like a red light of definition. And it's a blinking red light. This is a definition. This is binding. Declare and define. We declare, and also all of that language about the authority of Christ, the apostles, and our own. If you look at other documents of the Church, that precedes a definition. Pius XII, Pius IX. That this is like classic definition language. And some might say, well, this is not contained in Revelation, but it still comes under the power of the Church to infallibly declare, inasmuch as it is a part of the Church's role in promulgating and assuring the sacred liturgy and God's worship. See, so the Church cannot propose to us as someone in heaven who in fact is in hell, and where the Church would be offering masses in honor of a damned soul. See, so by that reasoning, it is, and all theologians agree with this, except some I would call two-bit unknown theologians in the past. All theologians agree, and it's common doctrine, that this is infallible. That is, that it is infallibly true that this whoever is canonized is in heaven, and that we must believe it, and that we must venerate this person as in heaven. There is no way to wriggle out of that from that language. And if you're trying to, you are deceiving yourself because you know better, because this is so obvious.
Yeah, all you have to do is compare this text with the previous texts that were issued by the pre-Vatican II popes, and this confirms it. It's the same sort of language to declare and define that this person is a saint. There's no change in that. And what has happened, or what happens in the R&R camp, is that they try to find, as we said, a way to wiggle out of this as an definition, and in so doing, it's another brick that they're taking away from the edifice of true Catholic doctrine on the nature of the papacy, the authority of the papacy, and on the infallibility of the church as well. So they use this. They try to get out of this particular requirement to back out of it. One thing that maybe I could ask His Excellency about is this, that a lot of the arguments that are made against the infallibility of these canonizations by the R&R camp are based on an understanding of the way that the teaching of Vatican I applies to ex cathedra statements by the Roman Pontiff. But would you say, Your Excellency, that this type of declaration is concerned not necessarily so much with the ex cathedra pronouncements by the Roman Pontiff, but as rather as something that's pertaining to the infallibility of the Church in general, that the Roman Pontiff simply expresses that?
Yeah, although, I mean, he has the supreme authority to do it, and only he does. So, in that sense, it's related. But yeah, he's speaking in the name of the whole church. But I mean, the whole reason for this is that he has the power to prescribe for the church liturgy and worship, and that falls under the disciplinary infallibility, and with the reasoning that the church cannot lead us to hell and cannot offer to us persons that are unworthy for veneration. I mean, it's very simple. I mean, I don't think you need to think about it too much. I mean, if the church does not have that power, then it's a false church. If it can lead us to hell, then we might as well forget about this church and look for something else. Because if all of these saints that are in our calendar could be in hell, that the church could be wrong about this and they could be in hell, I mean, what are we doing? What kind of a religion is this? I always say again and again that the key to the Catholic Church is the divine assistance to it. If you take out the divine assistance to it, and the infallibility of the canonization of saints is part of that, if you take that out of the church, the whole theological structure of the church falls down in an instant, just like the 9/11 buildings. It all just flops to the ground. So if you start saying, well, we could be deceived in this, we could be deceived in that, well, this may not be true, and so forth, concerning things that are declared and defined by the church, you're through. You undermine the whole Catholic Church.
I think what's striking about the language for me, Your Excellency, is the phrase decreeing that they are to be venerated as such by the whole church. So who are you to say, well, not for me, or that's a nice opinion, or if this man who you say is the vicar of Jesus Christ on earth, he says they are to be venerated as such by the whole church, and you say, well, that's optional. It just is so strange.
Well, he might be wrong, and it was an imprudent canonization. You know, that's what SSPX was, a very imprudent canonization. And well, imprudent or not, you know, because it is true that the Pope is not protected from imprudence. That's true. But imprudent or not, it's a canonization. So that really says nothing and means nothing. But we all know that they reject Paul VI as a saint because he suspended Archbishop Lefebvre, who's the saint of saints. And therefore, he could not be any kind of a holy man. We know the way they think. And that's it. I mean, how could you be a saint if you suspended Archbishop Lefebvre and suppressed the Society of St. Pius X, which they don't believe in either?
Well,
you know,
again,
all invalid acts.
You've covered this. You've covered this, I think, in some sermons as well as I said, previous episodes that we've had, including talking about a specific show that we just did on canonizations. That they get very hung up on process. So Father Cekada dealt with this with was the Tridentine Mass validly suppressed myth, that there is this idea that since they've gotten rid of the devil's advocate and since they've gotten rid of this extra miracle, therefore the process is what safeguards the infallibility and the ineffectibility of the church, and that's not it. The Pope could get up and name someone as a saint without any process whatsoever. Is that correct?
Correct. That's absolutely correct. And that's all covered in the theology books. That, you know, the anti-infallibility people said in the 19th century, well, the Pope needs to study before he defines. And then that's true, he does. But what if the Pope doesn't study enough and responds that the assistance of Christ to the church is such that even if he doesn't study enough, it is infallible? So you could say that insufficient research has been done, and therefore that's SSPX would say insufficient research has been done, therefore it's dubious. But that's just not true. It's again what the heretics said. For example, the church accepted all of the local canonizations from centuries ago, which did not go through the process that Benedict XIV set up in the middle of the 18th century. That's when this process was set up. But the church accepted the local canonizations of the various bishops and other holy people in various dioceses as saints, and they're in the martyrology, and they are in this universal calendar. And again, did they all go through that process? No. But if the church promulgates them as saints, then they are the object of our veneration. And again, if you take this away from the church, you ruin the church.
Yes, and the question here, which comes through the way that you lay out their argument, is that who decides what the process is? Is it the Vicar of Christ on earth who decides what the process is? Or is it, me in my easy chair in Westchester? Yeah, or in Menzingen. So you end up, in effect, with a sort of canon law Protestantism, where that what the Pope prescribes and what he promulgates is not binding on members of the church who are to submit to it, but they subjected to sort of private examination and decide they sift through it, as Father Schmidberger would say, and see what they accept and see what they reject. And that turns the whole thing on its head as well. Another
Protestant.
You end up it's canon law Protestantism. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that you end up with, or that I noticed in the polemics against the canonization of Paul VI, is that even supposedly intelligent people who are opposed to the canonization of Paul VI, who are part of the R&R camp, that the arguments that they make have no foundations in terms of any sources in traditional Catholic theology. It's just there was one article that I read by Professor Lamont, and he was very much opposed to this canonization of Paul VI. And there was one citation in the article to Saliveri's treatment on the question of the canonization of saints. But then this guy went on to say, well, these theologians didn't really understand what papal infallibility meant. And he gave absolutely no sources to prove his statements. And he just went along making one statement after another without really showing how it was somehow sourced, or what he had to say was somehow sourced or came out of traditional Catholic theological teaching. And that's because they can't. They absolutely
it isn't there.
Well, it's just so arbitrary, Father. And I think to myself, I'm thinking about Saint Philomena. Saint Philomena didn't go through the process. So how do we know that Saint Philomena is a saint?
Yeah.
Well, she got kicked out by John the 23rd. I don't know if you know that.
Oh, yes. Well, this is the thing is, then you're resisting John the 23rd's kicking her out and you're keeping her in.
Right.
This whole thing of, okay, Padre Pio is a saint, but this person isn't. It's so strange to me. I understand, obviously, people who have an understanding of who saintly people are, unlike Paul VI, have a lot of sympathy for Padre Pio being, let's say, considered a saint, but we don't have a process by which to make Padre Pio a saint at the moment. And we can still venerate him as someone who was a great example and shared holy thoughts and ideas for us to adhere to. But this idea of picking and choosing, it should strike even a Novus Ordo, someone who goes to the Novus Ordo, someone who belongs to the Novus Ordo sect, as very strange to pick and choose which saints they want to venerate and which saints they don't. It's very strange.
It's known as Protestantism. If you became a canon law Protestant, you would understand it completely.
The Pope speaks, you decide.
You've both said this in different ways and in different sermons, but you've pointed out that the urgency and necessity of canonizing Paul VI and John the 23rd is to baptize and canonize the council and to institutionalize the revolution within the church. And it's important for people who aren't clear about Paul VI. Paul VI was the man who finished off the work started by John the 23rd. So he promulgated all of the documents of Vatican II. He promulgated the new Mass. He promulgated the new sacraments. He abolished the Index Forbidden Books. He abolished the oath against modernism. He presided over the largest laicization of priests and nuns and religious in the history of Catholicism. He also instituted a reform of the Curia, and I don't think that's the kind of reform you would be interested in, Your Excellency.
No, he reformed it according to modernist principles. He already got rid of the Inquisition because the Holy Office was the Holy Office of the Inquisition. That was its full name, and of course that had to go. And now it was the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Modernists. And you know well, its history is abominable. Ever since he just took a huge hypodermic needle full of modernism and stuck it into every aspect of the church. And he is principally responsible for the debacle that we have today in the Catholic Church, Paul VI. That reign of 1963 to 1978. He did all the dirty work. And really, the ones after that, John Paul II and Ratzinger, and now this creature, are really just carrying out things that he did and set down. He really blew up the old church and founded something entirely different. So, I mean, of all of the people not to canonize, but rather to condemn, it is Paul VI. And he was the one, by the way, John the 23rd on his deathbed said, you must elect Montini, that is Paul VI, because he's the only one that will continue the council. So in 1963, the council could have been shut down. And little footnote, Padre Pio told the the prelates coming to him to see him to shut down the council. That's what he told them. But in 1963, that council could have been shut down. And even in 1978, there was a possibility of reversing Vatican II. And as you know, Cardinal Siri almost was elected. And because the liberals went into a panic the night before, when Siri would have passed the next day, they went into a panic and joined forces because they were split. And so they joined forces and put the crown on Wojtyła, who was John Paul II, super liberal and modernist. So Paul VI, that reign of Paul VI was really critical for the church because it could have been turned back even at that point. But this is just a way, and it's so absurd that you can destroy the Catholic Church practically and get canonized for it. I mean, this is just high comedy. It just makes you laugh that these people are saints that did all of this damage. I mean, it just is something to laugh about. That's all.
Well, I think in honor of that laughter, Novus Ordo Watch composed a litany in honor of the so-called Saint Paul VI, and I have to say it's quite a good litany. But some highlights for me were Star of David, Tower of Babel, notorious offspring of Lucifer,
right,
putrid lily, and father of apostates.
That's all very accurate.
Oh yeah, indeed. Well, as that woman in Rome said to us, that he was a monster. He really was a monster.
Yeah. But the formula, if there was a public formula, the thing to do on Novus Ordo Watch would be to play that, and then have laughter in the background. That would be a very appropriate message to send. That just somebody laughing his head off as Paul VI, and then a few pictures of Paul VI in the Indian outfits and all of the other crazy things he did. He was an ecumenical maniac, and started all of that stuff.
Well, preparing the way for JP2.
I don't think there was a single good thing that he did. The single good thing I give to John Paul II is that he cleaned up the front of St. Peter's Basilica. So, for tourism's sake and general dignity of the Basilica, I give him credit for that. Everything else he did was evil. But Paul VI didn't even do that. I don't think there's a single
I can't think of one thing.
Well, it might have been all that smoke of Satan that dirtied the front of the Basilica. It might have been coming out of somewhere. I suppose I would end this segment by proposing to our listeners who are uncertain about the current situation of the churches, if you do not accept Paul VI as a saint of your church, by what authority do you reject the formula of the man you consider to be Pope, saying that these are to be venerated as such by the whole church? Mm-hmm. I think that's a good question that they should pose themselves. And I think if the listeners have listened to how His Excellency and Father have answered those objections, I think they'll be very good food for thought.
A good idea for maybe a show, it would be a special show actually on Paul VI, in which the accusation, the book of accusation against him put out by the Abbé de Nantes in 1973, I think it was, quoting with all sorts of documentation all of the things he said and did that were scandalous and heretical. When you really add those things up, that is the book that made me a sedevacantist, because I labored for years under the idea that it's the bad bishops who are doing all of this nasty stuff in the church, and Paul VI, being the Pope, is free of heresy, and certainly he doesn't assent to this stuff. I labored under that for years, but when I read that was in 1973, I thought, oh my goodness, I had no idea. And that might, or to put up some of those quotes on Novus Ordo Watch would be good for people to understand just what kind of a human being he was. He was horrible.
Well, again, you're saying I think it's particularly helpful for people like myself who were not ever alive during the time of Paul VI. So it's very important for us to study that history and understand it better.
Yes.
If we look at Francis, as we said, he has not been too active in the last 3 months, which is the period that we're covering in this episode. But I think it's just useful to look at some quotes of his to, again, observe how does a modernist talk? A modernist is not clear. A modernist is not straightforward. They take things that are very simple and direct concepts and sow obscurity into them. And one of these examples could be found at a general audience on October the 31st, in which Francis is commenting on the sixth commandment. The first part of the quote is, "Who then is the adulterer, the lustful, the unfaithful one? It is an immature person who has his life for himself and interprets situations on the basis of his own well-being and his own contentment. Therefore, to get married, it's not enough to celebrate the marriage. One must undertake a journey from the I to the we, from thinking of oneself to thinking of two, from living alone to living in two. It's a good journey. It's a beautiful journey. When we succeed in decentering ourselves, then every act is spousal. We work, we talk, we decide, we encounter others with a welcoming and oblative attitude." Not entirely certain what he's saying there, but he goes on to say, in this sense...
Oh, it sounds real deep, as usual, right?
Yeah, it's deep in something, Father.
It is deep in something, yeah.
In this sense, every Christian vocation, now we can extend the perspective somewhat, and say that every Christian vocation is, in this sense, spousal. The priesthood is so because it is the call in Christ and in the church to serve a community with all the affection, concrete care, and wisdom that the Lord gives. Aspirants to the role of the priest are of no use to the church. No, they are of no use. It's best that they stay at home. But men are useful whose heart the Holy Spirit touches with a love without reservations for the bride of Christ. In the priesthood, the people of God are loved with all the paternity, the tenderness, and the strength of a husband and a father. Thus, consecrated virginity in Christ is also lived with fidelity and joy as a spousal and fecund relationship of maternity and paternity. I could go on, Your Excellency and Father, but again, I'm lost. I don't know what we're talking about here.
It's gobbledygook. And the thing is with these guys, is you press a button and random words come out in sort of in different order. And you can flip a lot of them around, and then it makes just as much sense the other way. It's the world of jargon. They're not interested in talking about the essence of things. They give you phony analogies and phony comparisons. Who then is the adulterer, or the lustful, or the unfaithful one? It's an immature person. So what you think when you hear some nonsense like that is that it's purely a question of immaturity. That there's a psychological immaturity in the adulterer that is present, and that somehow is a bad consequence and is problematic. It has nothing to do with the law of God and the fact that there's a commandment prohibiting this, and that it's against purity and it's against justice. But he takes it and he puts it through this psychological gobbledygook filter, and this is what you end up with. And it's a typical modernist method. Their typical way of discourse is to speak in this confusing way, and it pulls people in because it eventually causes people to think that really this stuff is really deep, and maybe I'm not just getting it correctly, and to buy it. But in fact, it's nonsense.
And I suppose by leading with the phrase immature, he's maybe opening the door to being exculpatory by saying, well, he wasn't fully mature, wasn't making it in good conscience, or his conscience wasn't informed, when the reality is people understand what the sixth commandment means, Father, I suspect.
Oh, yeah. And the immaturity business, of course, is one of the grounds for annulment under the new annulment procedures, that you've taken a psychological term, a vague psychological term from the pseudoscience of psychology, and you've used it to excuse sin.
Something we talked about in our last episode that came up again in another publication was Benedict XVI discussing the role of the Jews, or how the Jews have a, you could say, path to salvation. And there's new text from the last episode that we did, and this was published in, and now I'm self-conscious because of my bad German pronunciation of the last episode, so I checked it ahead of time. Herder Correspondenz, the December 2018 edition, had this from Benedict XVI. The Gospel of St. Matthew ends with the commission given to the disciples to go forth into all the world and make all nations into disciples of Jesus. Missionary activity among all peoples and cultures. That is the assignment Christ has left to his followers. The point is to acquaint people with the unknown God. Man has a right to get to know God because only he who knows God can properly live his humanity. That's why the missionary mandate is universal, with one exception. A mission to the Jews was not intended and not needed for the simple reason that they alone among all peoples already knew the unknown God. With regard to Israel, therefore, there is no mission, but only dialogue about whether Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God, the Logos, whom Israel, and without knowing it, all of humanity had been awaiting in accordance with the promises made to his people. To take up this dialogue once more is the task this hour puts before us.
Now, refresh my memory, Father Cekada, but isn't the Latin omni creature, that the gospel should be preached to every creature? Isn't that?
Yeah, is he secretly anti-Semitic here? Is he saying that the Jews are not really human creatures?
Because I remember a commentary, well, does that mean to the animals? I think that's every human creature, every creature.
Yeah, that's
omni
right.
creature. So this already is junk theology, because he's misquoting sacred scripture. He says, going forth into the world and make all nations. It doesn't say all the Gentiles, disciples of Jesus. It says every creature.
Yeah.
And that includes the Jews. And that's exactly what they did. The first persons that were the beneficiaries of the preaching of the gospel were the Jews in Jerusalem. If they had no mission to the Jews, then why did St. Peter and the other apostles go to the Jews first? And why did the Jews attempt to put them to death as a result of this preaching of the gospel? I mean, this is basic. This is, Bible studies, Pentecost Sunday, and St. Peter telling them that they crucified the Son of God, and that the whole speech to the Jews. It's in the Acts of the Apostles. And what did St. Paul do? Even in his mission to the Gentiles, what he did first was go to the Jewish communities of all of those cities in the East and set up the mission. This is, we set up missions, set up his mission among the Jews. And that was the reason why there was a big fight between the Jews and the Gentiles who had converted to Christianity, because the Jews converted, but they wanted to retain some of their old ways. And so St. Paul was very clear about that, and very clear that the old law had been shut down by the new law, and that those things were finished. And that's why he corrected St. Peter at the Council of Jerusalem about his activity, whereby St. Peter had not doctrinally deviated, but he deviated in his example by eating with the Jews and spurning the Gentiles. I mean, this is basic again. This is basic.
Yeah, you only get to this nonsense that Bergoglio or that Ratzinger is talking about by denying what's explicitly set down in Scripture about the mission of the apostles and about the conversion of the Jews. And even in the Matins readings today for the feast of the Holy Name, that point is made by St. Peter. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given to men whereby we must be saved. He's preaching to the Jews.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'll give you another example. The St. Peter was so convinced of the mission to the Jews that he had to be convinced by a vision from God to accept Cornelius. That's in the Acts of the Apostles.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
3 times the vision, lowered these ugly animals that the Jews considered unclean, and essentially said, what I consider to be clean, you should not consider to be unclean. So he had to be convinced beyond what was told to him before our Lord ascended. Beyond that, he had to be convinced that it was okay to go out beyond the Jews and to spread the gospel to the Gentiles. Again, this is like 3rd grade Bible studies. This is not deep theology. This is, really basic stuff. And you can see this junk theology that Ratzinger has, but where everyone worships him as Mr. Smart. Don't forget, this is the same person who said back in the 1970s, early 70s, that in the early church you could have divorce and remarriage because he misread the early church documents which concerned second marriages. That is for people whose wife died or spouse died already. And that and we just did this in church history, you don't have to be a brain. You don't need to know classical languages or anything to read this. And it clearly is a question of second marriages for people whose spouses have died. He interpreted that to mean that in the early church you could have divorce and remarriage. That was so stupid that later on he retracted it and said, no, I got that wrong. But for all of those years, it was sitting in a book deceiving people into the idea that in the early church you could have divorce and remarriage. I mean, this man is a dope, but he likes to show himself forth as some sort of intellectual, and he really doesn't know even the basics of Christianity, frankly.
I think that phrase there, Your Excellency, a mission to the Jews was not intended. It's so grossly wrong. And I see you were quoting different examples. I thought, well, what about the epistle to the Hebrews of all people?
Yes, the Hebrews.
That would seem to be a mission to the Jews.
Your old law is shut down.
Father Cekada, I noticed that you chuckled particularly, and I thought it might have been because this phrase, this sentence sounds so hippie-ish or maybe 60s-ish, but maybe I'm wrong. Man has a right to get to know God because only he who knows God can properly live his humanity.
Yeah, getting to know you, getting to know all about you. I think da-da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da-dum-dum, da-dum-dum. But so
emphasis on the dumb.
But getting to know God, but then the motive for it is not salvation. It's only he who knows God can properly live his humanity. That is so
the 1960s.
typical. Yeah,
we heard this stuff. That you can't be fully human. So this is essentially humanism with the chocolate sauce of Christianity on it. You see that you can't really be a good humanist unless you have God. You see that this was Maritain and integral humanism. That having God, you need God to be truly human. And we were told that
was the Paul VI obsession too. That it was all his discourses were shot through with all of this human this and human that stuff. The human being, the hope for humanity, and that we above all have the cult of man. All of that nonsense. I mean, he pushed it. Right.
Well, this is very typical. Remember Father Cekada? I don't know if you do. We were contemporaries in the same situation, but about 1,000 miles apart.
Yeah.
In the minor seminary, that you have to become more human. Do you remember hearing that?
Yeah.
I always thought, how do I become more human? What do I do? How do you become more human? But that was spirituality, to become more human. And you see, God helps you to become more human. I mean, this is really a lot of, just trash and garbage. But people worship him as some sort of a great theologian.
It's part of the modernist, denial of supernatural order too. It's all the natural order type of stuff, and we're human, and we're free to be human and free to be faithful, and all this other nonsense. And but it's religion stripped of the supernatural.
Well, when you say religion stripped, I'm reminded of a phrase that you and His Excellency spoke about, probably maybe in our first season or second season of Francis Watch. Monsignor de Lassus, this idea of Christianity without dogma, I think is that the correct phrase, Your Excellency?
Well, he dogmaless humanitarianism.
Okay.
So two aspects. One is no dogma, and the other is humanitarianism. And that is transforming Christianity into an aid to be more human, to help us to have a better world and a better humanity, which is exactly Bergoglio. All of that stuff about keeping the earth, treating the earth with tenderness, and the refugees, and he is incapable of saying anything supernatural. Everything he says is about, in some way, helping humanity. And it's always left wing and socialist and communist. That's so dogmaless humanitarianism. That's exactly what we have. And this was said by Monsignor de Lassus back in the turn from around 1900. He said, "This is what's coming, and this is what they intend to do to the Catholic Church. This is exactly what they've done."
The Abbé de Nantes, whom you mentioned earlier, who wrote the Book of Accusation against Paul VI, he wrote quite a bit about this humanism and the humanism and naturalism in Paul VI. And the one thing that I remember him saying was that the purpose of this Paul VI revolution was to turn the church into the Mas Dieu, which was the French initials for the movement for the animation of universal democracy. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a very good insight at the time. That, I mean, you could, Paul VI's writings were shot through with that idea. And yes. As well, it's the idea of Bergoglio, in effect, going with the leftist political transformation of humanity program.
Yes.
Well, this line of Benedict XVI seems to be echoed by I wouldn't call him a modern day Fulton Sheen, but he has a lot of media attention on various news outlets. And this gentleman, so-called Bishop Robert Barron, and he was interviewed on a video / podcast by Ben Shapiro, who is, according to Ratzinger, one of these exceptionals that do not need to have the gospel preached to them. And he was asking this Bishop Barron's whether he needed to convert to Catholicism, essentially. He said, am I in a bad position by being a Jew? And Bishop Barron responds, no. The Catholic view, go back to the Second Vatican Council, which says it very clearly. I mean, Christ is the privileged route to salvation. I mean, God so loved the world, he gave his only son that we might find eternal life. So that's the privileged route. However, Vatican II clearly teaches that someone outside the Christian faith can be saved. Now, they're saved through the grace of Christ, indirectly received. So, I mean, the grace is coming from Christ, but it might be received according to your conscience. So if you're following your conscience sincerely, or in your case, you're following the commandments of the law sincerely, yeah, you can be saved. Now, that doesn't conduce to a complete relativism. We still would say the privileged route and the route that God has offered to humanity is the route of his son. But no, you can be saved. Even Vatican II says an atheist of goodwill can be saved, because when I follow my conscience, I'm following him, whether I know it explicitly or not. So even the atheist, Vatican II teaches, of goodwill can be saved.
Well, talk about cursing the barren fig tree.
That's apostasy.
Doesn't get any more barren than that, does it?
Yeah, that's just apostasy to say that Christ is not the savior of all mankind. That's what's implicit in that he's the savior of everybody except the Jews, and the Jews do not need to accept him as the true savior or as true Messiah, and they can therefore be justified by their own religion and their own covenant, which no longer exists. All right, it's to say that Judaism still has value as a religion even after the Christianity and the New Testament, even after the coming of the Messiah. It is a religion that was created by God in order to receive the Messiah. So if the true Messiah has come, how could you possibly say that a religion still waiting for the true Messiah still has value in the eyes of God? You know, it's like in Europe where money, you know, they change the money and you try to spend it and they say, well, you know, this is no longer any good. I've had that a few times. It's been changed. It's something like a caterpillar and a butterfly. In other words, the Old Testament was the caterpillar, and when our Lord came, the butterfly came out, and it abandons its old skin to be a butterfly. So I mean, there's a continuity between the two things, but to adhere to the old skin of the caterpillar is, you know, it makes no sense at all, and it doesn't have any worth in the sight of God. It is to reject the true Messiah. How could you be more offensive to God than to reject the true Messiah? And our Lord's parables to the Jews are loaded with that very subject. That your vocation is going to be taken away from you because you will reject the true Messiah, and you will put him to death. You know, he's weeping over Jerusalem. I mean, the whole gospel is loaded with that. I mean, where does he get this stuff? I mean, all you have to do is read the four gospels, and you understand that Judaism no longer has a value in God's sight to lead men to heaven. It does not.
The other underlying idea that pops up here, generally as one finds in the modernist teaching, this idea that well, the Christian has the privileged route, but there are other routes that are acceptable as well. That's like the idea of the Frankenchurch ecclesiology, where you have in the Catholic Church, whatever you mean by that, you have fullness and you have all these good things, but other heretical religions can be means of salvation as well, and they're good, but they don't have fullness. So it's basically what you pick, and that's what I see by this idea of a privileged route. That Christianity is the privileged route, but Judaism is a route too, and is okay in its own way.
It's just such a strange phrase, Father. It's again, we don't find it in any theological manual. It's completely made up. And when I think of privileged route, I think of maybe the carpool lane. That's going to be a privileged route, or I won't have to pay tolls, or there won't be any potholes on my route. But you could take this other route. It goes through the mountains. It's a scenic view. It takes longer, but it's not a privileged route.
And it makes mincemeat out of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 12, concerning the conversion of the Jews. He dedicates a whole chapter to talking about Judaism and their ultimate conversion and all. I mean, that is meaningless if the Jews have a parallel and even privileged path to salvation alongside that of the New Testament. And that means outside of the blood of Christ. Because if they are not baptized in the blood of Christ and they can still get to heaven, that is a heresy. That's a heresy. Baptism is necessary for salvation. And you cannot repudiate baptism and expect to go to heaven. You cannot. And I'm not talking about invincible ignorance or anything like that. I'm just saying objectively, you cannot repudiate baptism and expect to go to heaven. So, I mean, that's a privileged path that goes off a cliff. And yes, you're in the fast lane and you're in the special, priority lane, but it's going to go off a cliff.
Well, the coup de grace is the finish to it, where he says an atheist of goodwill can be saved, and he cites Vatican II as his backup for this. And he's supposedly
Yes.
this lion of orthodoxy. He's so apparently orthodox that SSPX youth are shown his videos at youth group meetings, and Novus Ordo Watch documented this. So, behold, O Israel, your gods. If you're a Novus Ordo sectarian, this is a man who's representing your beliefs on a televised broadcast, and he says not only does this Ben Shapiro not need to convert, but that an atheist of goodwill can be saved.
Yeah, it is impossible to be an atheist of goodwill. St. Paul says that, okay? So we believe in St. Paul. I don't know what these other people believe in.
Well, these other people still believe that Benedict XVI might be Pope, Your Excellency.
Yeah.
There's a new book put out by Antonio Socci, and there's a translated blurb from it. And again, there's a bit of the same strange language that we've been seeing all throughout this broadcast today. The Church goes through the most serious crisis in its history, according to many observers. More questions are asked about what really happened in 2013 with the surprising renunciation of Benedict XVI, his decision to remain Pope Emeritus, and the coexistence of two popes. Why had Benedict XVI become a sign of contradiction? What was happening on a geopolitical level? Who advocated a revolution within the Catholic Church? And has the Pope really resigned? These are the questions Antonio Socci tries to answer through the facts, gestures, and words of Benedict XVI in these 6 years, discovering, as in an exciting thriller, he actually remained Pope, with consequences still unexplored. In this compelling and documented investigation, we try to understand what is happening in the Vatican, but above all, it investigates the mysterious mission to which Benedict XVI has been called for the Church and for the world. The author hypothesizes that there may also be supernatural events at the origin of his choice. Then there is to decipher an ancient prophecy concerning Benedict XVI, and there is finally a new revelation that comes from Fatima that not only affects the Church, but the whole world. I was thinking the mysterious mission to which Benedict XVI has been called might have been to say that the Jews don't need to be saved.
Yeah, that's... I think so. Is trying to sell books and get rich.
Well, the thing is that who's the publisher? Marvel Comics? I mean, it sounds like, exciting thriller, consequences still unexplored.
It sounds like a Malachi Martin novel.
Yeah, or a Malachi Martin history book.
It's pure nonsense.
I mean, Socci may say he was standing outside in the hallway when something was being read, and then he can give us this big revelation.
It sells books.
Yeah.
It's Malachi Martin stuff, and it's all nonsense. It's not even worth thinking about.
Well, something that I think is worth thinking about, Your Excellency, is the fact that Most Holy Trinity Seminary has worked its way into Francis Watch's news feed because there was an attack on the seminary after an article that you wrote. For the listeners who may not be familiar with His Excellency's really excellent articles on his blog about this, I think you must have been cogitating on it for a while, Your Excellency, because the Me Too movement was really a big thing last year. So I'm glad that you finally took the time to address it. But could you brief our listeners on what your position was in the article and then what happened in response?
It was essentially this theme that, of course, it's terrible that women are assaulted, absolutely, and men are mostly to be blamed, but that in many cases, there is a partial blame to be placed on ladies who don't dress properly and whose behavior is improper around men. And that this is quite common in the workplace. Also, a lot of these victims are people who work in show business and in the sports world, where there's, in the show business is not known for chastity and purity. I mean, if you're in show business, you practically have to leave your chastity at the door, and rather expect what's going to happen. And in sports, these people that play sports get very aggressive and think that they're like gods and they can do anything. And with all of the modern feminism, where women are in the workplace and interacting with men every day, there's bound to be more of this, and it's partially because of the dress and behavior of women. So, conclusion: I said women should dress modestly in order that they not be an occasion of any of this that is happening. Now, all of that is in accordance with Catholic morality and Catholic moral theology. There's not a single thing that I said there that is contrary to it, and there's not a single thing that is historically incorrect. Especially before World War II, I mean, women in the workplace were relatively rare. I think I recall, I said it in another show, that my mother, who worked for W.T. Grant, which was like a predecessor of Walmart, in a way, not really, but, that one of those big stores that sold everything. She worked there. I think she was in her late teens or maybe perhaps early 20s. In the late 1930s, and she said that the girls had to keep their engagement rings hidden because they would be fired, because it was thought at the time that it was not good that married women be in the workplace. Now, I mean, that's history. I mean, I'm not even commenting on that. That's just a fact. All right. But it does show that there was a sentiment at the time that this was a dangerous thing. And now that, of course, people would laugh at that today and say, "Oh, that was terrible, that's horrible." But I'm just showing that how things have changed within really one or two generations. And so, of course, I said all of these. I didn't give that example, but I said women should dress modestly. That's all I said. And then there was this. I got messages on the phone that were loaded with F-bombs and S-bombs, and that I was disgusting, and all of this really intellectual activity going on, and no one, not a single person responded with, "Here's why you're wrong." Here's a calm assessment of why you're wrong. No one. It's always, "Oh, you're horrible." I remember when I did put up a similar article about Kavanaugh, that according to Catholic moral theology, his word would prevail, in parity. In other words, where it's his word against hers, that because he's a federal judge, his word is superior to hers, and that therefore, in the equality of the testimony, you'd have to go with him.
Yeah.
Well, I got all sorts of horrible comments. Again, no one saying why. I think 2 people out of about 30 or more were calm and criticized me in a decent way. Everybody else was F-bombs and S-bombs. And the one lady called and said they're going to put a private eye on me. And my reaction was, "Well, I hope you do, because you're not going to find anything that's very interesting about what I do. Probably the biggest excitement is going to Lowe's or going to the bank. Those are the big things. The pet store, maybe to get some cat food. I mean, if someone were to follow me around, they would probably fall asleep. Occasional ride out to FedEx is another really exciting thing."
You had some problems with the website too, Your Excellency, correct?
Hacked. Yes, our website was hacked, and we had to pay a good deal of money to get it secure. It's okay now, but one of the blessings of it is that we're going to completely redesign our website in a way that will make it even more secure. So and our website, it needs some redesigning, and so it's a blessing in disguise. But it tells me, about the intolerant left. As I said, what happened to freedom of speech this country works on tolerance of a whole bunch of other people because it's such a mix of cultures and religions and ideas and everything. If that stops, if that tolerance stops, and if that decency toward people who disagree with you stops, you're going to see a country that's going to break apart. And that almost broke apart in the 19th century because people became hotheads about others who disagreed with them, both on the north and on the south side. Brooksville is named for Senator Brooks, who, after some fanatic from Boston in the Senate gave a speech against the South, and the hothead from the North gave a speech from the South, Senator Brooks went over with his cane and nearly beat him to death with his cane in the Senate. And I learned that Brooksville was named for that because there were a lot of people that moved down from South Carolina, where he was the senator, to Florida in the 1860s, and they renamed this, which I think was called Augusta. They renamed it Brooksville in honor of him. That's to show you how they felt about him. This was after the war. And the country almost broke up over that hot-headedness and that intolerance. And it to me, it shows a renewal of and all those Antifa riots and people covering their faces and beating up people and all. That's a very bad portent for the future to me, because I didn't say anything I didn't attack anybody, or it was just, this is what I think about the Me Too movement. I think it's a very bad sign for the future of this country. I really do.
Yeah, we had some 1-star reviews on Facebook, and we had thought to say, well, we are not the bishop's website, but we thought, well, we're associated with the bishop, so we're happy to take the 1-star reviews anyway. But I think people just were searching for your name, and it came up in some of our Facebook promotions of some of your articles or sermons, and they just wrote these nasty comments, and we had to go in there and delete a lot of them because they were just not respectful.
One other thing I would add, Your Excellency, you said at the beginning that you just repeated the standard moral teaching, standard teaching of Catholic moral theology, and at one point in the history of society, obviously, that even among non-Catholics, the need for modesty in women's dress was seen as something that is a value that a decent person observes. So,
yes.
but then beyond that immodest dress is provokes people. The people who deny that modern fashions, the bulk of modern women's fashions are dedicated towards stirring up lust and stirring up desire. I mean, what kind of bizarre world are you living in? Because if you just look at the covers of the fashion magazines at the airport, that is always the point. That's what's being sold on the covers, to make yourself sexually desirable. Yes. And the idea is that the dress in such a way that it stirs up lust, and that this is now a positive value in society because it reinforces how formerly oppressed women, how they now feel about themselves. So the thing is that you, in effect, were getting. I think what really steamed people is the fact that the people who criticized you recognized that what you said was true. That in fact the purpose of so many modern fashions and so many modern styles for women is precisely to do that, to entice others to desire. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's a hypocritical criticism that
I mean these women that wear dresses that show off their breasts so much now, you wonder why bother putting on the dress? Why not just go topless? Yeah. And you'd have to be insane not to say that is to say it's not going to incite a man again, and I also pointed out that after the 1960s, everybody has lost his inhibitions. The men are unchained. You were told to follow your instincts, like Clinton, just following my natural instincts. That was what he said after the whole thing in 1998. It was just following my natural instincts.
Yeah.
But this is the culture, that you just do what you're moved to do. I would compare it to walking through a high crime area with a pot of gold coins. Right?
Yeah.
And if somebody came up to you and shoved you aside and ran away with the pot of gold coins, what would any reasonable person say to you? Well, why did you do such a crazy thing? Of course you're going to get robbed in a neighborhood like that where there's high crime. Or a woman, walking around in a high crime area with a emerald necklace on that costs maybe $50,000. Well, somebody's going to come up and rip it off her neck. And then this, well, of course, what do you expect? But if she had been, say, at a very high society place where there was a lot of protection and people were decent, and somebody did that, they would not blame her at all, because she took all of the proper precautions to protect herself. And it's all very analogical to wearing a lascivious dress in public and in places where men have no inhibitions.
If you're interested in reading His Excellency's article in full, you can go to inveritatblog.com and find the article. It was from November of last year. Speaking of extreme reactions, something that had happened since our last episode too was that a Chicago Novus Ordo priest had to flee. He's now in an undisclosed location. He might be there with Vigano and Elvis and other people. But the crime, his crime, Your Excellency, was burning the rainbow flag.
Yeah, I know, which was a perfectly legitimate thing to do because it represents sodomy. It represents the glorification of sodomy, which is even worse than sodomy itself. The public glorification of it and justification of sodomy. Which is a crime that is very offensive to God, and which was punished by the destruction of Sodom. And by the way, there's a recent archaeological dig that shows that Sodom was in fact destroyed by fire and brimstone. And so in any case, that it was a perfectly virtuous thing to do, and which should be done by every Catholic hierarch. But I guess that was not the it was politically incorrect, to say the least.
Not only that, Supich asked him to report for psychiatric counseling.
Right. Well,
it must be crazy to do such a thing, apparently.
The Mundelein Seminary doesn't have a lot of, let's say, credibility. I mean, that's the Seminary of Chicago. I think that Chicago might be fairly well infected by a certain group.
Are you saying that they might have been burning the flag of the seminary? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that Chicago is well known for, let's say, sympathies toward Sodom.
Well, with Supich in charge and this man on the run, it seems as though, again, the extreme reaction to the truth that you put forth in your article, that there is a forcible reaction to this, and they're at a subconscious level, they know that there is something wrong, and so they have to react in a strong, irrational way. And we're seeing the same thing here in Chicago that we saw in reaction to your article.
The other thing that I'd like to point out about this priest in Chicago is the idea that he should go and get psychiatric help. I mean, that is a typical modernist trick that modernists will tell you if you criticize something as immoral or as contrary to Catholic doctrine, they will say that there's something psychologically wrong with you. They played that card time and time and time again after Vatican II. And the it's the same method as Stalin and his successors had in the Soviet Union. That if you were a dissident, if you said something wrong about the what the Soviet government was doing, you'd be shipped off to a place called the Serbsky Institute and for some re-education. Or you would be in China till now, even as we speak, that people are sent off for re-education to re-education camps to get them to think correctly. They're sent out to these camps in the west of China. So this is a typical leftist type of move that Supich is pulling off, and he's walking in the footsteps of the post-Vatican II modernists, and certainly in the footsteps of the communists as well.
Well, you don't even need to be sent off to a re-education camp, Father. Sometimes you can just be handed a white cassock and a malaria shot. And that's
in the Pius X Society, Steve.
You can be sent to go think correctly somewhere else.
Yeah, I think so.
We'll speak a little bit about that. Your Excellency and Father have both discussed this Sino-Vatican Accord on at least 2 previous episodes. We just have I would say they're minor news items because they haven't really been reported, but they had pretty major portent. One is that 2 underground bishops have been asked to step down by Francis, and they have obeyed. And 2 Marian shrines have been demolished. And that these are the results of the great deal that Bergoglio has signed. And I guess at this point, you're actually even on the natural level. So stepping back from the supernatural level, what natural good has come from this deal that the Vatican signed with China?
Natural good. I long for the good old days when the United States didn't even recognize China as a nation before Nixon went over there. I mean, this is a brutal regime, anti-Catholic, anti-decency. It's a Stalinist evil regime, and the United States, there was no trade between China and the United States because the idea was to starve them out essentially and to bring down the regime by keeping them in a state that was economically unbearable. And Pius XII condemned this state-run church and even excommunicated anyone who would claim to be a diocesan bishop in this state-run church. So this is caving in entirely to this awful, awful regime that is now threatening the whole world and is becoming quickly our enemy. They're going to be our arch enemy if they are not already within 10, 20 years. And we are the ones that built them up by all of that trade, and setting up all the factories over there and making them a viable nation economically. We are responsible for that, and this is just a sideshow of it, in a sense that this acceptance of that horrid communist regime in China, and of course, but Bergoglio is a communist. So, I guess he doesn't object to this, and that you have a communist regime inculcating humanistic, communistic ideas for him is fine.
It's just a very different perspective from when Pius XII reacted to the actions of China with excommunication. It seems as though, where did Francis get the idea to ask these 2 bishops to step down? Did he know them personally? Is he very familiar with the church in China? That he felt that they were incompetent? Yes, he was told what to do and he did it. It's just such a strange thing that in a certain sense, the Chinese have achieved exactly what they wanted. They are the head of the church in China, and they tell the Bishop of Rome what to do, the so-called Bishop
Why
of Rome.
are you surprised?
I'm wondering what the diplomatic chess is behind such an agreement. What natural good is he getting? Obviously, there's supernatural betrayal of the faith, But there must, even in the natural order, there would seem to be some reason for this treaty. But when I see things like this, like shrines being demolished and bishops being stabbed in the back, it's just out in the open.
I mean, as you raise the question, I can't think of anything. What, as you say, even from the natural point of view, what Bergoglio and company are hoping to gain, because the persecution of those who are, who at least try to be Catholics, is something that's going to continue. That's not going to let up. He's just simply sold out to them, and because he is a communist and a socialist. He's not exactly, maybe he's not exactly the same type of communist or socialist as the members of the Politburo are in Peking. But, as we always say, it's sort of like gangsters. They all have different ideas and different agendas. But it ends up being a complete sellout with absolutely no benefit.
Unless there's some monetary consideration, maybe. You never know.
Yeah, could be. Or maybe they're getting cheap athletic shoes to sell in the Vatican shop or something like that.
Or better yet, free iPhones or something.
Yeah, free iPhones.
Yes. Because in a certain sense, they're in the front line. Even in the Novus Ordos, this is a regime that's hostile to Catholicism. In whatever form it sees. Here in Europe, the governments don't care anymore whether you believe it in a certain sense or not. But in China, they still really do, and they will come after you for believing the faith. So this treaty, to me, is totally unintelligible.
It's the country in which it is illegal for priests to let those under 18 into the church. You can't even attend Mass if you're not 18 years old.
Well, that was enforced under this new treaty.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you recall, the person who went there to set up the whole thing came back and said China has a truly Catholic social order. I mean, this is how bad it is. That's what he said.
Yeah.
This is how bad it is.
Well, speaking of how bad it is, Your Excellency, the last item that I want to talk about today was the first official interview of the new Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X, Father Pagliarani. And he had a couple quotes which I found very interesting, but to me indicate that meet new boss, same as old boss. He said, on relations with Rome, there is one public, official, clear source, which still imposes on us statements with essentially the same doctrinal contents. And two, the other one that emanates from one or another member of the Curia with interesting private exchanges containing new elements about the relative value of the council, about this or that point of doctrine. These are new and interesting discussions, which should certainly be pursued, yet nevertheless remain informal, unofficial, private discussions, whereas on the official level, despite a certain evolution of language, the same demands are always repeated. So he says there is a public, official, clear source which still imposes on us statements with the same doctrinal contents. And then he goes on to say, but I've got some buddies in the Curia who tell me otherwise. But we can't talk about that publicly.
Yeah, that's the Roman whispers business. And, we used to get that with Lefebvre, too. That there'd be these different Roman whisper stories about, Monsignor Spadafora and Monsignor Pintinello, and, that I talked with this cardinal and the Curia, etc. And that's simply to string people along, as far as I'm concerned, because they're in. I don't know. It seems that they're sort of back like flies in amber again. That they're in the same situation with regard to the Vatican as they were before, and things are just sort of carrying on in the same crazy Neverland way.
Yeah, and it's their way of showing their people that they are submitted to Rome. You see, they're talking to the Curia, and they're trying to get this approved, and trying to be lifted up to the point of recognition that they deserve. And this is ongoing. And you see, we are submitted to Rome and Rome and Rome. And we have these whispers in the Vatican hallways. And it's this charade that they present to everybody. And it's all part of it. And what is one public official clear source which still imposes on us statements with essentially the same doctrinal contents. Well, isn't that the purpose of the Roman Pontiff and of the Vatican, to impose upon us doctrinal contents? Don't they have the right to do that?
I was fascinated by the giveaway in this language here, Your Excellency, because he says it's at a public official clear source. So he's identified what, this is the source, and then imposes on us, meaning tells us to do it. And what that means is you're refusing the imposition. If you say that this is one thing that is being imposed, he uses the language imposes on us doctrinal contents. Who are you to refuse the imposition of doctrinal contents?
Yes. Well, if you're the vicar of Christ on earth in Menzingen, that's you can refuse what the Holy Father says to you and imposes upon you. That word impose, in other words, this is not, some sort of give and take or let's discuss this, imposes upon us statements. Because we have to sign something that we refuse to sign. That's what that was essentially saying.
No encounter or accompaniment there. It's just the imposition.
Right. This is it. Sign it and we'll be okay. Which means that they have to accept Vatican II the way everybody else does.
So in the same interview that he gives, he goes on to say, the priestly Society of St. Pius X is deeply attached to the successor of Peter, even when it opposes the errors of the Second Vatican Council. Okay, this first statement is problematic. He goes on, however, we are deeply distraught by a fundamental characteristic of the current pontificate, a completely new application of the concept of mercy. It is reduced to a panacea for all sins without pushing for a true conversion, the transformation of the soul by grace, mortification, and prayer. In his post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, the Pope gives all Christians the possibility to decide case by case, according to their personal conscience, the questions of morality and marriage. This totally contradicts the necessary and clear orientation given by God's law. We see here an echo of Luther's spirituality, a Christianity without the need for moral renewal, a subjectivism that no longer recognizes any universally valid truth. This has caused deep confusion among the faithful and the clergy. Every man is in search of truth, but for this he needs the direction of the priest, just as a pupil needs the direction of a teacher, and I suppose just as a Catholic needs the direction of the Vicar of Jesus Christ on earth, Your Excellency.
Well, he's saying that the Pope is a heretic. This totally contradicts the necessary and clear orientation given by God's law. That means that the Pope is a heretic with regard to moral doctrine, that he is teaching moral heresy. And then the name Luther comes up. I mean, he just confirms exactly what he just said, that this is essentially the Lutheran idea of morality. I mean, what else do we need to say?
That I suppose that very first statement here, Your Excellency, sort of gives us the orientation of the SSPX, this double think that you have to have. The Priestly Society of St. Pius X is deeply attached to the successor of Peter, even when it opposes the errors of the Second Vatican Council. Well, who promulgated the documents of the Second Vatican Council? St. Paul VI, who you have decided is not a saint.
Yes, change it to he. In other words, what is it to the successor of St. Peter, even when it? Who's it? What are we talking about here? The successor of Peter is not a robot. There's maybe it's referring to the Society of St. Pius X, but it's the same thing, that they sift and he's the Pope, but we don't pay attention to him when he says something wrong, and he's infallible except when he's wrong, and all of that nonsensical idiocy that comes out of their mouths for decades now.
What was fascinating about Father Pagliarani for me, Your Excellency and Father, was recently our annual meeting for True Restoration was in Verua, Savoia this year near the IMBC. We want to make sure that we meet as many clergy as possible. And Father Juni told us that some years ago, Father Pagliarani came to the Institute and was seeking to potentially come into the Institute before he was sent to India to think about things for a while. And just like Father Paul Robinson has become somewhat of a superstar in the American district for the SSPX and also had some, let's say, encounter in the past, that this man is now in charge of the SSPX, but had come to the Institute just some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He must have some clue about what's going on here.
Yeah, I really don't know the man, so I can't comment too much. But that is interesting that he did do that. There means that there's some thinking going on in his head. At least I would say this, that he has a brain, because when he speaks intelligibly, and you understand what he's saying. When his predecessor spoke, it was all gobbledygook, and you hadn't the slightest idea what he meant or what he said. I mean, he would have made, a perfect government minister, where you just talk and nothing comes out except unintelligible nonsense. At least it's clear what he says. I mean, you can understand what he says, which I would, I'd say that's an improvement for the SSPX, that the superior general has a brain.
Do you have anything to add, Father?
That's an awful funny comment. An improvement that you have a superior general who has a brain. No, it's more of the same attitude, and he is a little clearer, a little more comprehensible, but it's in expressing the same confusing and erroneous theology of the Society of St. Pius X. So I don't think that it represents any sort of a substantial change in what they're up to at this point.
Yeah, remember Father Cekada said, and this is more topical, that even when they go to Mars and there's like a whole colony on Mars, they're still going to be trying to cut a deal with the Vatican. This will be like 100 years from now, and they'll have a mission up Mars, and we're still trying to cut a deal with the Vatican. It's like a movie that never ends and repeats the same scene over and over again.
Yes, and I mean, I think we pointed that out during 2014 during when we did the fat lady. The fat lady post about how the fat lady never sings.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
In other words, that the opera never seems to come to an end. She keeps, on threatening to come out onto the stage, but I guess never finally does. So it just keeps on circulating. He's like Fillet. He's still milking the Roman cow. And he doesn't have to feed it by, the sense of giving anything up by actually obeying. So it's a beneficial situation for him to be in the center of that, because you draw people from both sides. You draw people from all the way from, say, the Rorate type of Novus Ordo conservatives, all the way to, maybe you get some people in there who are sedevacantists, who are figuring, well, it's all going to turn out all right. And it keeps on going. And because you have no real operating principles, you just act, and you say things that could go rightwards or leftwards. It's still the goose that lays the golden egg. It's a very successful formula that they've come up with. And why spoil that? Why having to pay for feeding the cow?
Well, Your Excellency and Father, we're through perhaps the busiest time of the Christmas season. Perhaps Your Excellency could tell us what's going on at the seminary.
absolutely nothing. And I'm so happy about it because nearly everyone has gone home. But I should mention that one of our seminarians from France, he's our only one from France now, is seriously ill. It's something that he said, he's been feeling for even 2 years, but it's gotten acute lately. And that is gastrointestinal problems, chronic and so bad that it keeps him up at night. And so he's been missing class. He's been showing up late in the morning. He couldn't go to mass. And then it affected his heart. His heart rate went very low into the 30s. And one day it was even 23. And we had to rush him to the hospital. 23 is really dangerous. And we had to rush him to the hospital. And so he got a little better in the past 10 days, say, but he's back in France now, and he's going to be looked at in France. He really needs a diagnosis of his intestinal problems, etc. But I'm certain that he's lost the year. And I fear terribly that he will lose his ability to be a priest because his health is not good unless they come up with a very clear cure for what he's got. It could be an intestinal obstruction of some type. But the point is, please pray for this person because he's a very, very good vocation. He's very intent upon being a priest, and he has all of the qualities of being a good priest. And we're just devastated. He was supposed to be ordained a subdeacon at the end of February, and then a deacon in June, and then priesthood in the following June in 2020. And so if he's impeded by this problem, it's a disaster for us, for him, for the church, for France. He would be a very, very effective priest, and I just pray to God that he makes it.
As you say, he's a good vocation. He's also very French, and the French need more very French clergy.
Yes, he would be perfect in his home country. Now that brings us to Father Duterte, who is being very active now in Quebec and has a strong following in both Quebec City and in Montreal, and he's building it up, and he's. As he said, they have adopted him and he has adopted them. They feel comfortable with him and he with them. And he says he's very busy. He says Mass there 3 Sundays a month. There is another priest, Father Roi, R-O-I, which means king, who comes in from New Brunswick. He's ex-SSPX, but he's affiliated with no one. He's just on his own. And he's a sedevacantist and comes in and says Mass on the off Sunday, which is the third Sunday. And so that's what's happening up there in Quebec. So it's moving along well, and it's as cold as could be up there, but he's fine. And so it was really something that we weren't counting on, but it developed, and there was a lot of people up there that needed a lot of direction and the Mass more often than they were getting it. They were getting a spotty Mass now and again from various clergy. And so their theological ideas were not very well formed. It was just Latin Mass, that was it. And so we're very pleased with the progress of that. And then Father, here I'm saying, there's no news here. Father Palma, out in Arizona. Now he's not really seminary, but he was from the seminary. He just bought a building that he will transform into a church in the northwest sector. It's a place called Youngtown, which is next to Peoria in Arizona. So that's a little progress for us. And and then, but as far as the seminary, as I said, the seminary is always the same. And we teach courses. They have exams. We feed the cat. That's about life at the seminary.
That's not necessarily the order of importance.
I was going to say the cat feeding is the first order of importance for the cats, of course.
Feeding the cat, keeping actually the cats keeping them happy is the first order of business at the seminary, and the rest, is quite secondary.
I have a sneaking suspicion that is the same order at St. Gertrude's.
You certainly could say they're very, very demanding animals. So they as the Arthur Miller play said, when the cat, the attention must be paid.
Yes.
Here at St. Gertrude's, there's been a fair amount of stuff going on. We, of course, had Bishop Dolan's 25th Episcopal consecration anniversary, and that was at the end of the month of November, and the Feast of St. Andrew. We had priests from different parts of the country who visited. Bishop Sanborn gave a excellent sermon on Bishop Dolan's apostolate over the past 25 years. I also, on FatherCekada.com, put up a little resume of how Bishop Dolan came to be consecrated as bishop and what he's done since his consecration in 1993. So that was a very big, very big occasion. We had a splendid pontifical high mass, beautifully sung by the choir, and a very nice reception. People from all over the country, and we had the Gertrudian Advent, kind of quiet, but with different novenas and naturally with different devotions. We've begun the 12 Sundays of Our Lady of Good Counsel. We have some particular devotions to her, and we chant an antiphon in her honor after 12 of the Sunday high masses. We had Christmas, a very good crowd at all the Christmas masses, a splendid midnight mass, and then this coming Sunday, Bishop Selway, we invited him to come up. He hadn't had an opportunity to celebrate Mass and to preach for a congregation up here since his consecration last February. So this coming Sunday, the Feast of the Epiphany, he's going to be up to celebrate Pontifical Mass and to preach, and we have a little reception for him after that. The other future things on my plan, I'm going down to the seminary as usual in January. Later that month, Bishop Dolan is going down for the seminary's retreat. He's also going down in the month of February to Brazil to a group of Sedevacantist priests and religious that we came into contact with down there, and he's very hopeful and very optimistic for Brazil. We got good reports from Father Nkamake, who is back in Nigeria now, tending to his all of the missions he takes care of, which are, it's a very, very impressive apostolate. He has 2 Nigerian seminarians at Most Holy Trinity, and they seem to be intelligent men and good vocations. So it's a little bit of what's going on at St. Gertrude the Great. In July, we fixed a date for the YAG, the Young Adults Get Together, and we will, if you're on our mailing list, you'll be getting notices about that. I think that's in early July. We've had, I think, at least 2 marriages come from the past YAGs, and there are a couple more that I can sort of envision being on the horizon or about to be announced fairly soon. So that's working out very nicely as a part of our apostolate. So we ask that you keep that in your prayers. And I add to what Bishop Sanborn said about this French seminarian. Please do keep him in your prayers. He's a very good young man, and we think a very good vocation. And we certainly pray for his cure.
And I think that's an excellent way for us to end the episode. As always, Your Excellency, thank you for your time. Thank you, Father, for your time.
Thank you.
And we thank our sponsor, Novus Ordo Watch, for making this episode available to the public.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.